Welcome everyone to another kind of game design of the month episode here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. I am back with my friend Tomo for another chat about some of our favorite designs and some of the games we want to take another look at. And for this episode, we are going to Monster Hunter, more specifically Monster Hunter World. But before we get to that, Tomo, how are you doing this, for me, very blistering heat and rainy day where I'm at?
Yeah, it rained a little bit yesterday. I'm in Southern California, for me as well. But yeah, it's hot. I'm doing pretty good. I feel like there's a lot going on in the game industry right now, and thankfully, it's mostly games.
For now, at least. We'll see how it ends this year. But yep, this is going to be one that I've really been looking forward to, because Monster Hunter is a series that it certainly has had, I think, its ups and downs over the years. This is the one that I'm sure for people watching this recorder right now, they have probably at least heard or experienced it over the past, I think, 15 years. But originally, I believe it started out on PlayStation 2, then it went to PSP, then it went to the Wii, it went back to PSP. It has been all over. It's been a franchise Capcom has certainly I don't know, it kind of felt like Capcom just didn't really know what it wanted to do with it, at least at the start. What did you think?
Well, I mean, I think when it comes to the stage, it's an okay example of a game that didn't really have a whole lot of precedent for it. You know, you could be as simplistic as saying, let's take the idea of fighting a boss and making that the whole game, but it's so much more than that. It's a new shape of an experience that has its strengths and its weaknesses, and I think I'm really glad that Capcom stuck with it and found basically there's some gamers are Monster Hunter gamers because of it.
Yep, such as us right here as well. And yeah, it's one of those franchises that it never, up until, we'll talk about Monster Hunter World for sure in the coming minutes, but it always kind of existed, on, the edge, I think, of a lot of discussions. Even when it got ported to the Wii, I forgot there was a 3DS version of it as well at some point. It was one of those franchises that it kind of felt like it had the opposite trajectory of, say, Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy went to all the platforms. It seemed to jump all between them over the past 30 years, but each game there found massive success. Where Monster Hunter, it just kind of it was popular. Don't get me wrong, again, there are a lot of fans of it, but it never achieved the numbers that we were talking about with Monster Hunter World.
Yeah, no, I think it took some time to sort of build up, and it took that time to get that user base.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like when it started off, it was almost sort of like that that they had discovered this really great niche, and they didn't realize how big it could be, or maybe they did and they pulled it off, but they had enough users to keep going, but maybe not so many users that they could go totally crazy. And if honestly, I think if they went totally crazy earlier, they might have done some things like take away some of the things that aren't awesome about the shape, but that might have really messed things up. And now it's an enduring. I think it's an enduring title that's here sort of to stay, even if it's not. It doesn't have to be the biggest game, but it is big enough, and we're not saying it's small by any means.
Yeah, and in a way, as I was thinking about how I want the topics I want to cover for Monster Hunter, it reminds me in some way, shape, or form with the trajectory of Fire Emblem, as Fire Emblem also had this period of they didn't really know what they wanted to do with it. It was popular, yes. It was one of Nintendo's more banner franchises on the DS, and then moved to the Wii, or I'm sorry, to the GameCube. But again, it kind of occupied that space of it's there, but how do we take it to that next level. And there's probably a greater discussion to be had about how certain franchises go from being like a niche popularity to having that blow up game.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably a good topic, actually. Well, it requires a data exploration,
Mm-hmm.
at least to some extent, right? Some criteria. It's the type of games that there wasn't a version of them before, and they were successful enough to warrant a next attempt, and then the next attempt was bigger, right? And it's sort of a it's tricky in that that doesn't happen as often as it used to. I think back in the 80s in PC, there were only different types of games.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think early 2000s is about the time when in the console wars everything becomes just like four or five genres. Um, and people might even want to describe Monster Hunter as a one of those genres, even though it probably deserves to be called its own sort of shape. And I think when Dauntless came onto the scene, that kind of validated its genre by saying, "Hey, we're not Capcom, and we're making the same kind of game."
Mm-hmm. And it's very funny about Dauntless. Like I felt like Dauntless was kind of set up to have like the Path of Exile success. Like Path of Exile, of course, succeeded very largely to being right there at the right time when Diablo 3 fumbled out of the gates. And again, like when we talk about the original release of Dauntless, that was 2019. Is that right? It feels like it's been older than that. Huh.
Well, I mean, anything that's before the pandemic seems older.
Yeah. But like the major thing that Dauntless had going for it was that this was still during this period where Capcom, I think a lot of other like major Japanese studios were still very hesitant about bringing franchise, especially niche franchises, to the PC. And that's another topic at some point we should probably get into about how that mindset has really shifted over like the past, I would say like 5-7 years now. I mean, we're seeing the Nippon Ichi games coming to PC. We're seeing same day for stuff like Elden Ring and what was some of the other ones? Remnant that just came out. Like the era where you could kind of split your game, being this is a period only for console, this is a period only for PC. I think that has really like came and went. I don't think that's really like the trend anymore.
Well, I mean, there was a long period of time where PC was kind of a bad idea.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that really worked its way into the console industry. I remember being on projects and them saying something like, "You get $50,000 to make the PC port. So which coder do you want to do it, and what percentage of their time adds up to that amount of budget?" And they're like, "All right, well, we like PC still because we remember we remembered the golden era of PC. So we're like, yeah, we'll get a PC port out." And then, but we're going to shortchange it from a time standpoint because the users just weren't there. It wasn't. It didn't feel like, and I'm talking like 2004 to 2010, let's say. I think that's probably a good description of the time frame where the console industry sort of lost its appetite for PC games. And by lost its appetite, it's kind of like when like sometimes people, if you can't afford to, you don't make a Mac port. And it's not a criticism of the Mac. In fact, I find that games with Mac ports, it's usually a good indicator of something sort of a principled perspective on caring about all the users, but it is like 1 or 2% of players. And so, if it costs any reasonable percentage of your resources to make a Mac port, it is very hard to argue in its favor. And that definitely was happening in that era for console to PC ports. But now PC is awesome, so there's nothing to argue.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and again, like what we were just saying I'm sure, like for the older people watching this, they remember when people were decrying that Xbox was going to kill PC games, and that was going to ruin the PC. We would never need a computer again. We've always brought up again like Steam, that when it was like this weird little thing that anyone back in 2004 saying like this is never going to hold and change how we play games forever.
Yeah, no, I think, and you know, honestly, even though I played a lot of PCs back then, I it didn't look good. I mean, you know,
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't going to be surprised if there was going to be a project cycle, and you know, there were plenty of games that didn't port to PC, but games that for which it is easy, like a first-person shooter, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
that they at some point were going to go like, no, we're not even going to release it because I don't. It's not like, you know, we've gotten big enough. Our marketing strategies for every SKU has a certain minimum amount of expenditure. All this stuff's in place, so now it's no longer on the docket. Like that was going to happen, and it would have made sense to me at the time. In fact, for me, I feel like that period of time in PC games was like the period of time I got to become acquainted with Eastern European development, and to some extent the stuff like um, Paradox Interactive's kind of beginning. Like they kind of filled in that space when it was a lot more empty and there's a lot more opportunity.
Yeah. And I think as like while this may be kind of a tangent, I think it does fit with tracking the success of Monster Hunter. As part of the thing I think that held Monster Hunter back for so long was just the hardware and the platforms that was attached to it. The PSP, I remember trying Monster out on PSP and not having like a dedicated, like easy to use like 3D camera is a hell for a game like that. And as we said a few minutes ago, like Monster Hunter has had a dedicated fan base since the original release, but it always felt like it was hamstrung by the device that it was on.
Yeah, and I think this is also a period of time when we went from open world games are just almost impossible to open world games are pretty common, right? And not it's not common because it's still very expensive to make those games. There's a lot of content and lots of sort of like large time scale design, which is can be scary. But once that stuff became easier, better understood, and more players were maybe open minded to it, and the PC thing started to have like, you know, there were enough users there. I think
Mm-hmm.
it that's when it found its sort of permanent home, even though it's always going to be cross platform as far as as far as I could guess.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of like when we talk about like Monster Hunter, it really did occupy. You said this at the beginning that it kind of stands in its own little genre, and it is such a like fascinating game. And for people watching this who somehow not play Monster Hunter, in terms of the general loop, it kind of focuses on like a mission by mission format. So you're not really exploring like a huge world. And then your target is, of course, whatever is the chosen monster. And each monster, it kind of occupies that space as a boss fight. That you're fighting it across the entire region, you're trying to track it, capture or kill. And it really does follow, I think, like philosophy wise, a lot of the same kind of structure we saw in something like Shadow the Colossus, or even going as far back as like the Punch Out games, where it is about focusing on a singular target. So, how we make that singular target as unique as possible?
Yeah, and you know it's a puzzle fight, and it takes time. Um, you know, I think you can look at there's like a trajectory from like a Halo to Call of Duty, for example, where fights between players go from taking like 10-15 seconds to taking 1 second. And the time to kill goes from a certain like, you know, the tools for someone to survive and for the fight to be this duel that takes time kind of goes away in a lot of genres as sort of and I don't mean this in a bad way, but like more instant gratification, um, um, turning the crank on rounds faster and faster and
Mm-hmm.
faster. Like sort of the move, like from baseball to basketball, might be a good description as well. That this move was happening in so many genres, and as a result, that vibe or that feeling of like a long, protracted relationship with your opponent sort of disappeared. And maybe that's what made space for it.
Yeah. And I mean, we could even like compare this to the rise of Souls likes. That many Souls likes focus on a more kind of like grounded sense of pacing, where if we look at a traditional action game or traditional first person shooter, you're fighting 15, 20, 30 enemies at a time. You know, your character is jumping, flipping, and just killing everything. Whereas in a Souls like, and by extension in a Monster Hunter, just one thing is a very credible threat. And the monster designs have always been one of the more standout respects. It was doing like I think a really good job of like a random pattern fight long before we were having this discussion with Dark Souls.
No, yeah, and it's hard. It's the same kind of hard as Dark Souls. In fact, I guess since we're talking about it like this, it's pretty interesting that it never came up as in the conversation about hard games, right? Because they're obviously it's the same mechanical difficulty, but it feels a lot different, and maybe it's because it's a little messier.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as crisp. In fact, in some ways, it's less. It's. I don't want to say it's less harsh because it's still harsh, right? And it's still super difficult. In fact, if anything, sometimes there's all these like sort of things I would criticize, like finicky control difficulties, things that you don't feel like you can't control that go wrong, and all kinds of messy moments that happen. But it
Mm-hmm.
all kind of comes together as like a really positive experience in its totality. Whereas like the Souls-like interactions are very precise and very controlled, and this will work and this will not.
Yeah, man, I wonder if part of like that kind of, I guess like memory holding, the difficulty of a Monster Hunter, comes from the fact that it doesn't really have like that same kind of like punishment or that feeling of punishment. Because I know we had our conversation about Dark Souls and difficult games a while ago, and we discussed how they really hammer home that point that death is failure in Dark Souls. You get the big red ominous "you die" on the screen, the whole fight resets. Where in Monster Hunter, you die and your guys go, "Oh, I just fall over. My cat friends will take me back to the rest space. We're gonna get up, eat a giant thing of food, and then we run back out there and start hitting it again."
Yeah, no. In fact, I think even though the mechanics have similarity, I think that you bring up the right point in that you can suffer against some of these harsh mechanics, but it doesn't result in failure, right?
Mhm.
It often results in, oh, well, I guess I'm going to have to just approach this differently. And you can sort of, even though it takes so long that it's harsh and punishing, you can sort of bang your head against monsters for a long period of time and succeed,
Mhm.
especially at the beginning. In fact, it generally, well, at least with the more recent Monster Hunters, which I played a lot more than the more early Monster Hunters,
Mhm.
you can basically pay the price in how long it takes to take out a monster and sort of do a very bad job with the mechanics,
Mhm.
which then I guess pulls it away from hard. And rather, there's just a broad range of actually, there's like lots of different solutions, actually, even if a lot of the solutions are really slow and really messy and rife with
Mhm.
weapons bouncing off your target and doing nothing and taking damage and getting knocked away.
Mhm. And I think also having it kind of like built in around multiplayer about being this group activity also helps to kind of offset some of that difficulty. There are people I know who play the Monster Hunter games and they will never play it solo. They will always go for multiplayer, they will always join other games. And it is a very different beast, no pun intended, when you have like four people together. You know, this guy is like jumping off the ledge, hit him with a hammer. You have this one, shooting with the bow, the giant sword shield guy. It becomes a very interesting aspect. And I guess, would you equate or do you see like elements of Monster Hunter and kind of like early MMO design? This idea of like getting together for like a raid or getting together for like some like very like over the top challenge.
Well, I think it seemed like it was niche at first, partly because of this, right? That probably people who played raids in EverQuest, who then played raids in WoW, said like, why don't we make a game just about this, right? In fact, I even feel like I've heard people talk along those lines. That was for some of the words in people's minds when you're thinking about these kinds of games. Um,
Mm-hmm.
like it's interesting because there's sort of this mixed bits of DNA from games from before that kind of came into creating this, I think. And
Mm-hmm.
Capcom making it, I think, is like another piece of the puzzle. On one hand, it's very makes perfect sense that there's this sort of action, sort of slasher-like mechanics, but at the same time, it's not the same slasher-like mechanics. It's not the same kind of rigidity in the way the game is played, and there is this sort of like MMO interpretation of sorts. You got to hunt down some of the old uh, team members from the first project to get a better insight into what they were thinking.
Yeah. And I think that's a good segue in terms of like the MMO class role thing to discuss the different weapons in Monster Hunter because that in of itself we could probably spend an hour or two just breaking down playing each one of the classes in it. And it is one that like when we think about Monster, I think this is the only game I've played that really goes like all in on making every weapon feel legitimately different. When we look at kind of like how a lot of like action and maybe even like action RPG games kind of evolved over the past 10 years, a lot of them went for a very like sameness to it. Like, yes, it's a shotgun, but it's just, a different version of a pistol, and the pistol's a different version of a sniper rifle. This time, it's basically like I think we're up to like 16 or 18 different weapon types in Monster Hunter now, and it's basically like 16 different games almost with how you can approach them.
Yeah, actually, this is. I want to make this point when you were talking about Paths of the Exile. One of the problems with making a game, a Monster Hunter like game, is that it's fundamentally sort of costly, right? The essence of it is there's a lot of animations, and there are these, and not like fun and easy things. I mean, okay, it's fun if you know what you're doing, I suppose. But it's not easy to create what amounts to a character in a 3D action melee game that's sound and works against all these bosses, right? I mean, you can think of in terms of like from a development standpoint, what's complex about these games is that we have a monster and it has these vulnerabilities and these behavior patterns and these attack and defense things, and those need to damage and create challenge for what amount to like 10 or 15 different characters that are created in these different weapon styles. And some of the weapon styles have enough similarity to each other that they're basically the same shapes, right? If you have like weapon archetype, that there's probably sort of like the two-handed swords are slower and it's about getting the timing right, and once you get them hitting them and you create vulnerability windows and you try to get a lot of damage in. Or they're the ones that are like dual wielding that are much faster and you don't disable them or stun them as much, so you have to be bouncing out, and you'll tend to get your attacks stomped rather than stomping their attacks. And they take on these really different sort of mentalities in approaching monsters. Designing that it's pretty hardcore. And granted, maybe they've had a half a dozen or like nine. Is it nine Monster Hunters? Many titles to kind of get there. Maybe it's five. Five? Is it six? Five or six? I mean, if you add all the other, there are some that are on other platforms, right? So it's kind of got that. Um, oh, I can't remember the name. Like games that have been on multiple platforms and not always cross-platform sometimes have like so many titles.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what I'm getting at is that this complexity is something to be impressed about with respect to Monster Hunter.
And for sure. And I gotta ask, what weapon do you main in Monster Hunter?
Um, and honestly, I mean, I played the big heavy sword. Well, a couple of the big heavy sword types, and then some of the faster, and then one faster one I played for a decent number of hours. So I had those two in Dauntless. Though I actually played probably 75% of the weapons and explored sort of those mechanics. So some of it was shooting and running around and flipping around and shooting, and some of it was those fast dagger-like things. Although I generally prefer the kind of slower, chonkier, heavy hits and trying to like weave those into the behavior patterns of the monsters.
Hmm. For me, it's always been about the hunting horn. I've been a hunting horn main since the very beginning. I've watched that Jack Black meme video at least like 5 times a year now, and like Monster Hunter does, I think, a really good job, as you said, of like balancing these very different like archetypes of how you play with the nature of the enemies themselves. Some will obviously have an easier or harder time, but it kind of follows, again, like with this MMO comparison, that having a team that can fulfill certain roles will obviously improve your chances. If you're fighting a flying, one of the main flying dragon types, having someone who can do range attacks and knock them out of the sky will obviously help more. Whereas if you're fighting against one of the heavy hitters on the ground, having a shield, having someone who can draw aggro will obviously be more important there.
Yeah. And I mean, and this might be a criticism actually, is that it takes a long time to get deep enough into the game where a lot of these things start to matter a lot, right?
Yeah.
That you are allowed to advance and not understand how to, you know, defending yourself from like the T-Rex looking guy's charge or something. You just don't at first, and you do fine. And then at some point, pretty late in the experience, you know, 50-hour plus into the experience, now you can't anymore. And I think that it's an interesting choice. You know, it has that feeling, that sort of Blizzard game like WoW or Diablo, where it's kind of easy until it isn't, kind
Hmm.
of thing. And I don't have an answer for that, honestly. It's, you know, managing players that play games for hundreds of hours is, none of us have done it enough to know what's right when people do it different.
Yeah, and that is a really solid point. Like, I remember, like, for me playing Monster Hunter World, at the time where, like, the rubber kind of hit the road there, was during the Final Fantasy tie-in event. You fight, like, this world boss from FF14, and it's just like, okay, we're just running around, and then all of a sudden, the boss just casts his meteor, and then there's, like, meteors falling down, and we're like, how do we dodge all that? And it is that, and I think that's a very interesting point to kind of stay on for a minute. In terms of moving, like, the player through things. And unfortunately, Steam stats seem to be acting a little iffy right now because it's not letting me view the achievement rates or the clear rates on Monster Hunter World. But the Monster Hunter games, I think, still have that issue when it comes to proper onboarding. That as we bring more about Monster Hunter World specifically in this conversation, like each one has had, I think, a very tough time of guiding someone through it. And part of that again is the sheer number of weapons. But again, there are so many like layers of subsystems in a Monster Hunter game that it's very easy to look at these games and just saying it's just basically like Unga Bunga strategy. Just run the guy, hit him with your heaviest attack, rinse and repeat. But there is so much about like building like a character that gets taken for granted.
Yeah, it's, and I mean, so I think some of it gets self-corrected. Like, I don't pay attention to any of the side mechanics, and I just smash monster until I can't. And then once I can't, then I have to pick one of the other subsystems, and then I explore it, and and I find that I have tons of materials, so I change my weapon or I build like a booster of some sort, and then I start trying again. And it's probably not even the booster that gets me to succeed at that point, right? It's that I had to stop. I lost. I had to pay
Hmm.
attention, and then I get over that hump. But in the process, I've learned a little bit of maybe about crafting, you know, bullets for a gun or something, and then I run into another hurdle because I'm not paying any attention. And this isn't the way it is if you're paying a lot of attention. You know, we know that there are plenty of players that actually carefully advance every single system, probably wasting some amount of time. I mean, waste is not the right way of describing it because I know when I do that, I enjoy that. But you move everything forward together and you're paying a lot of attention to everything and you're imagining what impact it's having. But because you're doing it all at once, you kind of don't know what impact any of the systems are actually having. You just know that they're all there. and then this other player that's just sort of got their eyes closed and just smashing their face through the game and having a great time of it until they're forced to stop and pay attention to something new. Those two approaches, I'd have a hard time saying which one is more common in Monster Hunter.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and with like that kind of like difficulty bump, I also want to say I have never used the bow gun in the game, so like all the ammo supplies, that's all seems weird and strange to me. And it is like
and dozens of bullets you can craft, by the way.
I know nothing of it. All I know is the different songs I can play, and I hit someone in the head with my hunting horn. it,
Awesome.
it is like that again is something that we brought up a lot when we talk about difficulty in games. Is what happens when you hit that wall? How does someone respond? And Monster Hunter is quite weird in that respect. In that the progression of it, it's both very implicit and explicit at the same time. It's implicit, as we said, like the player learning. What's a good time to dodge? When the monster lifts his wing up, what does that mean? But then there's that explicit aspect of, am I using the right weapon for the job? Do I have a good armor set? And have I taken the right food buffs to help? And that's the kind of stuff that feels a little bit harder to explain to someone. So I guess. Oh, go ahead.
I feel like lots of players, and sometimes myself included, we just do what makes sense to us, and we have no understand. Like we don't know if it's right.
Mm-hmm.
We just think it is because that's what we do, and we keep advancing forward.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't complain about that experience because it seems to work for so many of us. Like, could it be better? Yes, but lots of things can be better.
Yeah. So I guess that gives me a question I want to ask you. What are your thoughts on the weapon or the gear progression in Monster Hunter? And for people watching who don't know what we're referring to, like beyond just going down each one of these 16 different weapons, you have different versions of each weapon that will correspond to different either elemental types or different kinds of monsters specifically you have to grind. So if you want to get more poison, if you want more of a poison sword, then you need to go grind the monsters that obviously have poison parts. If you want electrical, ice, fire, whatever. And like that's I think one of like the more interesting aspects of this game is that even if you choose one class, that doesn't mean you're just using one weapon and that's it for the next 80 hours. Like with me with the hunting horns, I typically have at least 3 to 4 that I will switch to based on what element they do and what buffs they provide. And I know other people, like for the more offensive weapons, they probably have the similar strategy.
Well, I mean, even though the game starts off as killing monsters and learning mechanics and the way monsters behave, like, that you're kind of fantasizing you're a hunter sort of and tracking them and everything, eventually it becomes farm video game bosses for
Mm-hmm.
materials so that I can make my way to the ultimate version of the weapon I like.
Mm-hmm.
And and then, people are not wrong when they complain about the grindiness. I mean, the number of times you're going to kill that weird lizard thing that puffs up its throat and different versions of it is so many. And, there is something interesting, 30 hours into the game that those guys just aren't hard anymore. That you can kill them pretty quick, surprisingly fast at some point. And it's a good feeling when that starts to happen. That when you see them, you don't get depressed and go like, I don't want to spend 4 minutes killing this thing. I'm powerful enough and I can kind of take them down quickly. And then you see a new one with new colors and maybe it's hard again.
Mm-hmm.
And that's well before suddenly you're like, oh, these guys fly. What am I supposed to do about that? It's an interesting sort of conceptual evolution of your perspective on the game.
Mm-hmm. And I did manage to get some of the Steam stats up on just the website, and the game does have quite a bit of churn to it. Like, this is one that I'm sure the vast majority of people probably never made it to the expansions, let alone actually got to the end of them. And
Oh, for sure.
a lot of it is just as you described. It does turn into that grind. And this, I think, is oftentimes where the games kind of lose me. Like, one of my criticisms is that I feel like it hits that drop off point of progression being meaningful enough to keep me playing. Because, like, when I brought this up, some people are like, well, that's just the point of the game. You are supposed to spend the next 100 hours grinding 6-star maps or 6-star monster hunts to get, like, the super ultimate, super duper weapon. But it does reach that point where it's like, I have my ultimate weapon. I don't need the ultimate weapon. Like, it doesn't, like, it kind of loses that motivation. And again, like, when we talk about, losing motivation, I'm talking like 80, 100 hours in. Like, this is like way beyond like a normal game. But it does like feel to me like it doesn't quite stick the landing when it comes to the ending, like leaving a Monster Hunter game.
Yeah, this is something interesting. I think that when you're making these sort of long haul experiences, that last step isn't always designed to be the step you expect everyone to take. You know, you can think of it as this giant curve of users, and somewhere at the peak of that curve is where you're kind of building the game to get players to. But then you see that there are obviously players that are more hardcore, and maybe there's a lot of them. So you need for them to be able to do something, and you need to give them something for that effort and the time they put in. And so then the rewards though might start to diminish sort of in impact, or diminish in terms of the resource costs to make those available. But you make the time spend expenditure spike to get those, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're in a lot of ways you're trying to deter people. It's like, hey, only if you're really serious do I want you to get this last thing. It's going to be really take a lot of time. So that means you have to really enjoy this, and then I'll give you this thing at the end. And it's not as good as getting the third to last thing and then getting the second to last thing. That's the best thing you could have gotten in terms of how much extra stuff you get for accomplishing the goal. This one, most of the accomplishing of the goal is that you overcame this, and I just wanted to make there space for you to play, and there still be a goal for you. And it's not 100% clear if there are counter arguments to this, right? It's like, why build experience and water it down or slow it down, um, and then give them something that's less of a relative gain than the game before. Like, that seems sort of cheap. But the flip side of that is they're playing, they're having a good time, they want more, and I can give them more. I can't. How much I can give is limited because we have all these progression threads, right? And they all theoretically come to an end. And where do you taper it off? Like in Spider-Man 2, there was some objectives that, frankly, we didn't think anyone would complete. And it turns out that a decent number of people completed them. But maybe our argument, if I wanted to say cool things about myself, is that there was something so intrinsic about playing the swinging around the world that, yeah, of course people want to do it more. But there are intrinsic things that are really cool about killing monsters in Monster Hunter Forever too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when we have our conversation about like ARPG and RPG design, we'll have to bring that back up in terms of like how like that the pursuit of loot, it always has that peak. That, going from your first weapon to your second weapon is like this, but then going from your second to third is maybe like that. And
Yeah.
it gets so much harder. And what you described about kind of like, it's almost like that kind of mountain climb analogy. Why do you climb a mountain? Because it's there. And we see that like with like every Monster Hunter game to date. Like, if you're a fan of Monster Hunter, you know two things are going to happen. One, there's going to be an expansion, and two, there's going to be some masochistically ultimate super devil monster that's going to wait for you at the end of that expansion, or they'll add that in DLC or like free updates after the expansion is out. You know it's coming. And, are you going to be interested in that? Are you going to want to play that? How many hours to get to that point? And like we've said, like, there's no shame in saying, you know what? I play this game for, 30 of 120 hours. I got my fill. I'm done. I don't need more. It's not like a buffet that's like forcing you at gunpoint to go back and get 10 more plates.
Well, and frankly, it's. I mean, I kind of have to play these games this way. That
Mm-hmm.
the time committed to sort of in quotes complete them is too high, and then so I have to fit in how far I can go. And so I may, inevitably at the beginning, I kind of just blindly have to make some choices about whether I go broad or whether I go deep on a single thread. It's like this totally strange approach to this type of entertainment that comes in these blocks that are so large that you have to sort of think ahead on how you're going to actually manage that.
Yeah, like these are not games. Like if you really want to play them, they're not like the kind of game that you play like an hour a week. Like
Yeah.
this is like, okay, this is gonna be my new game for like the next month or two, or every night I'll play at least 2 to 3 hours of it. And again, it like this as we were talking about earlier with kind of the niche reception of Monster Hunter. Like this is one of like those really like unalienable facts. You can't really like if they made Monster Hunter like faster, it really wouldn't be Monster anymore. Like if it took you like 2 minutes to be a monster, that's not what that game is about.
Although they could maybe cut back on the number of times you have to kill them to grind up to get to the next step. They could probably do
True.
that a tiny bit.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's it. Take every Diablo game that's ever come out. Like, yeah, if you cared about the story, maybe you could play it for 20 hours. But you wouldn't have explored anything in terms of like all the mechanics and progression that they build. It's like if you
Yeah.
played Grim Dawn for 20 hours or just the first difficulty setting, you complete the story once. It's like, no, you didn't actually play Grim Dawn.
Yeah, and that I think is a really good point. Like for people watching us record right now, I'm curious what you think. As would you consider to be the end of a Monster Hunter game? Because again, like some people will say the end is I get a new weapon. Some will say I clear the main story, and that's another again like point. Like to a Monster Hunter fan, clearing the main story, that's again as we said, that's when the real game begins. Once you when you get the credits, that means the game starts.
Well, this whole the term end game really means that, right? It's when you reach the point in the game where what you are intended to do is this cycle of behaviors, and that it goes and that cycle repeats many, 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 many times, and that hundreds of hours can get put into this, and that you can do that with friends, and that
Mm-hmm.
you're chasing these very long-term progression goals, and sort of like scratching out single percentage points out of the power of your of your gear or your build. It's when you kind of take that last step to have this total understanding of the game, and then you're comparing how total your understanding and play experiences with other people's slightly more, slightly less total understanding,
Mm-hmm.
and that
And
can feel good. I mean, there's a reason why so many of us do it. Um, I mean, now as I'm getting older and looking back on all the time I've spent on some of these games, it's harder to commit to doing it because it is such a large time expenditure, and a lot of it is legitimately very, very repetitive. At the same time, when we're doing it, we're not. It's not like we're upset. It's something that we have comfort and excitement about starting into.
mm-hmm. And the kind of like bite-sized focus, I think, of the game, or bite-size of the actual encounters, does kind of like help give it like I think a far better framing than some of the other games that we've played. Where again, like we've talked about this with roguelike design, that a good roguelike is not 100 hours of game. It is 40 minutes to an hour of really precise, really fine-tuned experience that you do again and again. And Monster Hunter kind of occupies that same track. Like I think the longest hunt is maybe an hour, and that's like end game where we're gonna have you fight like 2, 3 bosses on a single map. But for the most part, 20 to 30 minutes if you know what you're doing to take out a single monster, and that's again something that can be repeated, as everyone knows, a whole lot in these games.
Yeah, I bet we could even if there was like sort of like a data analysis of these games that get these really long engagement periods. you'd find that there are probably only a few sizes of chunks, right? Like what is a Destiny raid or a World of Warcraft raid or um, uh, what are some other good examples? Like yeah, these sort of like these later fights in Monster Hunter World. Um, what is something I've done recently too? See, they sometimes they feel like they take a long time, and they can, like, let's say you get stopped and you try like a fight, like if it's a WoW raid, you do a single fight over and over and over again, just die like 70 times or something. That can make it take all day, sure.
Mm-hmm.
But once you sort of understand and it's like a regular challenge, they all start to fit into these time frames, right? Like how long is a dungeon in Diablo or something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that does become important when we talk about, as you said, like games that have been around long form kind of play, where they're expecting you to do this over the long haul. So we have to make that kind of long haul content very like bite sized. It has to be very compartmentalized compared to the rest of this experience. And like with something like with a Diablo, I think again like it still has that limitation that at some point your reflexes are going to be as high as they're going to be. Like you're not going to be able to go ultra instinct in one of these games. And then it just comes down to the progression. And is that progression enough to keep someone playing? And again, that really depends on the person behind the controller.
Well, I mean, the designs of these games have become more sophisticated and sort of better tuned for long term play. Yeah, you know, the mechanics have to change, but mechanical changes are expensive, so you have to be sparing on how you like release those. So between mechanical changes, there's power increases, right? And the power increases allow you to overcome these challenges. And then once you get this mechanical change, now you go back through all of the challenges and with the new mechanics. And then if you've added power, you can have more powerful versions of them so that the new mechanics, you go through them all again. And then it's a power gain again. And then there's your next mechanical change. You can go back through all of it and try it out again, right? It's that if you become a different thing, then playing all the same content again becomes at least mildly interesting. Or the more interesting it becomes, the better you've tuned this up so that those changes feel more meaningful. God forbid you wrap a story around it where having done it the 70th time is something of some significance. I'm thinking about how good a job Hades does of sort of replaying something over and over and over again, have a point and a
Mm-hmm.
reason, even if it is sometimes just having a continuing a dysfunctional conversation with your father.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and it's like trying to build like those moments of making this repetitive action very engaging. That Monster Hunter has done well. Again, I think it's one of the keys to how it survived for so long. Let's see.
Well, and it did it in a shape, right?
Yeah.
That that wasn't one of the old shapes that came before it.
Mm-hmm. And
Right? It took some pieces. It got DNA from all the other shapes that had long engagement paths, and then made something that sort of new.
and we need to. I know we've had this discussion before about how certain games just kind of become genres onto themselves, and like no one else has managed to like go in that same direction. Shadow of the Colossus I mentioned earlier would be another really good example of this. And I wonder if part of it is like budgetary, and part of it could be just be like, do we really want to compete with the big dog of this specific design?
Well, my view from the inside of these teams is that you really it's impossible to envision hundreds of hours of gameplay with mechanics and progression and with multiplayer. Like that's not just something you can kind of come up with, right? For the most part, the experts, they'll extend what's come before it and they'll innovate on it and they'll improve the path, they'll lengthen the path. They might add like a parallel track to that existing path that's just a little bit different, but now you could travel down, and if that different path was different enough, they could break that off and make it its own thing, but it still feels sort of derivative of what came before. And there's good reason for that, in that we had, let's say you had like a team of 10 designers, and they were all super veteran, and they had all this experience creating experiences for hundreds of hours for thousands or millions of users. It's still super hard to make something even kind of new, right? And so making a whole new shape is sort of the veterans, like, are you crazy? You know how much money they're going to try to put into this. What are the chances that it succeed? Not that high. We see people make these efforts at these MMOs, and they're not often super different even necessarily, right? And so it's this sort of like soul shaking difficulty from a development standpoint. And I think that somewhere in all of that talking and worrying about difficulty of making these things is the Monster Hunter story, where they tooth and nail clawed their way into this shape that other people weren't expecting.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, to add legitimacy to what I'm saying, you could take that Spider-Man 2 long-term single-player experience of just flying around the world on swinging on webs, and all the time and all the richness of kind of moving through there, and how that can keep you engaged. And then you build little activities around it. It's not the same. It's because it gets, it's like a big multiplier to go, now we're just going to let all these people play together in that space too. But that's where some of my insights into this complexity at least come from. And, then you could say that there's this superhero genre of long-term solo play in these Spider-Man games that have evolved over the course of the last 20 years or so to this point with the Insomniac games.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, there you go.
And to that point about, trying to sit there and say, how do we reinvent the wheel? We had this entire conversation when we talked about Vampire Survivor last month, or whenever we last did that recording.
It was a lot more than last month, but yeah.
Oh my goodness. And yeah, it's that same idea of, can you reasonably do something legitimately different? And can you do legitimately different that's going to outperform the game that everyone knows? And to take this back to Dauntless for a second, I played Dauntless for I think about a week, and it was okay. But then the second I heard, hey, Monster Hunter World's coming to PC, it was just like, pull the trapdoor button, see you later. We're going to the big one.
I mean, I put a decent amount of time into it. It definitely, Monster Hunter, the advantage Monster Hunter had is that it was made with that sort of week by week seasonal action experience kind of mindset, but it wasn't enough. That the original was coming out and coming back, and so it wasn't different. It didn't bring anything new other than sort of being more elegantly a sort of free to play hardcore PC game.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, it sucks. It sucks that you have to change that. Part of that is that you can't just make the same thing other people make.
Nope.
And so you should do me instead of them, because and maybe sometimes people make a better thing and then it works, but it's hard to beat the original because they have more experience making that thing than you. I mean, sometimes a lot more experience. And if you let's say you never had the opportunity to see 100,000 people play the game for 400 hours or 200,000 people or something. That's an enormous amount of information. So the other team that has done that, they can outmaneuver you. They're like, actually, we already know what the important parts are. You're just guessing.
Yep. And it's, again, that level of play testing, that level of feedback, that I think that's a really good segue to talk a little bit more about Monster Hunter World specifically. Because we're about 50 minutes in, and we haven't even talked about the game that we're basing this entry on. But Monster Hunter World, back at the start of this, I mentioned Fire Emblem. And I think both Fire Emblem and Monster have very similar tracks, in this respect that both games had respectable niche fan bases, but they weren't growing. And as the story goes with Fire Emblem, again, like Nintendo basically gave Intelligent Systems an ultimatum saying that if this game doesn't sell, it was like 5 million copies or something at the time, we're pulling the plug on Fire Emblem. And it basically gave them this idea of, well, if this is going to be our last game, throw all the taboos that people were going to complain about, anything that would be considered controversial for a Fire Emblem game. Let's do it. Who the hell cares at this point? And it turned into the best-selling Fire Emblem game of that time and single-handedly saved the franchise. And while I'm not sure if Monster Hunter was in that same level of on that bubble of being canceled or renewed, I remember looking up interviews when I wrote a piece about this. I think it was back in like 2019, where the goal of Monster Hunter World, like from the beginning, was how do we make a global successful Monster Hunter game? How do we take away the things that stop people from enjoying? How do we turn this into a hit rather than a niche?
Yeah, I mean, I have a feeling they did run into the same problem, but I think some of the solutions I think are still really relevant, right? That they took some risks and they were already on a path where they have this weird shape. And you might feel inclined after a Monster Hunter game to really spend a lot of time so that whacking it with a club or a hammer is smoother. And what I would say is it never has gotten smoother. And it's not smoother necessarily in Dauntless either. Like that's a feature of the game is that sometimes whacking on monsters is sort of sloppy and unpredictable and frustrating because you don't get the result you want. Now, one might, someone who's like a critic of the game model might go, I think we should fix that. And then we'll be able to compete better. But that might be missing the whole point, right? It's like actually these things that take a long time, some of these like planning elements, these frictions that are in the game that are honestly kind of weird. I'm going to cook food or whatever. Let's focus on those more. Let's do more of these weird things and like really sort of make unique the experience of kind of going through our world. And that sounds like a risk in our industry, even though
Mm-hmm.
if you look at the history, innovation is always been a part of things going well. Certainly, there are plenty of new things that people have done that didn't work. Um, but but at the same time, like if you logic that out, it's not that you can protect yourself by not taking risks. It's that it's actually that this is a volatile industry and you have to take risks and you have to get it right or
Mm-hmm.
things go wrong. And the not doing that is still having things go wrong. You just die slow. And that's okay too. Like plenty of games out there that are doing awesome, get all these users, make a bunch of money. That's a great time to die slow. But if
Mm-hmm.
you're just starting out, you don't have that option.
No, no, you don't. And with like Monster Hunter World, a lot, like as you were just saying, was about smoothing out those pain points, about trying to get people into the core gameplay. And one of the things I remember was having a far more extensive tutorial. They really hit you over the head in terms of this is how you move a character, this is how you fight. They did not take it for granted that Monster Hunter World was going to be the first game for people. And we've had this discussion, I know, about approachability and onboarding, and these are very important aspects, and they're one of the reasons why certain games will become massive successes and where other ones won't.
Yeah, yeah. It's so complicated how to get to these points.
Mm-hmm.
And you might look back at all the various Monster Hunter games and point to one where various innovations point to one or the other where various innovations were made that were important for Monster Hunter World. Um, and I know what was the game before Monster Hunter World? Is that 4 or X or something? X. Now I'm looking it up. Okay, there's just too many.
Yeah.
Um, maybe Monster Hunter X, I think, right, is an important step, and that's when things are on the trajectory to end up like Monster Hunter World. They figured out a lot of their mechanics and captured that really epic feeling, because I think that's really the important step, right? You have to feel like you're fighting a boss. It has to feel like it's worth it.
Mm-hmm.
But
And I
there's so
think,
many pieces of that puzzle.
and I think another thing that really helped was this is when they decided to make this for a main platform rather than being on a handheld. Like even when it went to the Wii still really wasn't like set up for online play as they were wanting it to. And there's definitely a lot that has to be said about kind of the game being right for the platform that it's on.
Yeah.
And like Monster Hunter World, both console and PC, it finally made like the multiplayer component very easy to do. And again, like this was a franchise that used to be you had to connect using like the whatever like the PSP like connection line was. You had to do like local kind of like client that kind of interface. And yeah, again, like it worked, but did it actually really help that game at all?
Yeah, that is a good question. And you know, I guess they had all this time. Like when you have that, when you are successful with the Nintendo audience, I don't. I think that there are very few conditions that are as good a way to kind of like become a shape that gamers will like.
Mm-hmm.
Because, and you're right, not a ton of games break out of that because it's good. It's good to stay in the Nintendo sphere and just keep those excited fans.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I didn't really recognize the degree to which that Monster Hunter World was a move breaking out of the Nintendo boundaries.
Or as probably more like the PSP's boundaries as well. Like it had a lot of things when it comes to Monster Hunter that, as we said, so many of the difficulties of that game are what's happening under the surface. The UI and the GUI have always been very rough, and a lot of that again came from being built on like a PSP platform. And it's unfortunately one of the things that can really screw a game. Like if you put the wrong game on the wrong platform, it one the audience may not be there, or two the platform may not be there. As a good example of this, I still hold that if games like Viva Pinata or Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts were ported to PC at that time, like a respectable port for it, they probably would have done so much better. And it's again one of the reasons why we talk about how multi-platform releases really do matter these days, or they should have always mattered, actually.
Well, I mean, they matter to everyone in a lot of ways except for Nintendo exclusives, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's
Yeah.
like Nintendo is more than just the platform. It's sort of a family of ideas too, somehow in a way that like the other platforms never could get there. I mean, Sega maybe to some extent, right? But Sega is no longer hardware, so
Mm-hmm.
um,
Yep.
yeah, it's interesting. Like you could imagine like an alternate timeline where there's still Sega systems and that Sonic has a place
Mm-hmm.
in this sort of weird idea of these sort of family of these console IPs.
Mm-hmm. I think another thing that World did as well that kind of helped it was I'm drawing a blank on this. So, any like old school Monster Hunter fans, please correct me in the comments. Was World the first time that you could legitimately play it single player, but had NPC backups with the cat characters? Because I don't remember.
Oh, you know, I guess I don't know the answer to that, but that is something interesting to kind of. It's an interesting feature. You could definitely play without worrying about those guys, but they did help out quite a bit, huh?
Mm-hmm. They were my tank in a lot of cases when I was playing solo. And I think, like, to the point you said a few minutes ago about having all these hours of feedback at your disposal, I think is a very major point about Monster Hunter World's success. That they could sit back and say, here's all the data of all the games we've played. What do people actually like about these games? Because, like you said, for like any developer, it can turn into a guessing game of, well, I think this game did well because it has moody music. I think this game did well because it was overly difficult. But being able to sit there and have the data to show you that, hey, maybe a lot of people quit because they got confused about the UI. Maybe a lot of people stopped playing at the 20-hour mark because this boss was very difficult. and you can then start kind of dialing in the experience from there.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you that is such important information because what feels obvious is so frequently irrelevant. There are a lot of cases where it's something sort of structural about like the choices that are available to you. Then it's just confusing. Like the game leads you down a path to um, where you have to like pick a new type of equipment or something, but there's a way to get there that's easier, and one of those choices isn't available, so you're just really confused, and then that becomes a place where people stop. And then but someone from the outside might think, well, this is so grindy, and I don't like how grindy it is, so we should make it less grindy. And it
Hmm.
feels totally obvious, and the other designers would say, yeah, that's what it is. And then you just do that, and it's not that that's a problem, it's that it just doesn't change anything. It's
Hmm.
actually that players are totally fine with how grindy it was. There's this thing that they run into that's very specific that you could only have seen if you had access to the data.
Yep. And it's how you have to start being able to like build these experiences out and about approaching them as a new player. A
Yeah.
lot of what Monster World did was it really kind of, I think, recontextualized the kind of like story or like story format of that game. Like we said, like for a lot of people, the game doesn't end when you get to the credits. But for people who've never played a Monster Hunter, if you get to the end of the credits, that's still like 50, 60 hours of gameplay. You can walk away from that and say, well, man, I'm done. Like, okay, I saw the credits, we beat the big monster. That's it. And again, I think a lot of that success of World was about making the player feel good about leaving the game, about, again, having a way of saying, like leaving with a satisfied look on their face, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I bet you could figure out some math where if they would play for 20% longer, then it's okay if they don't feel as good leaving. But if
Mm-hmm.
you can't get them to play that much longer, then it's better for them to leave on good terms.
Mm-hmm.
Something along those lines. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. And I think as someone who, again, my memory of the older Monster Hunters is definitely failing me, but Monster Hunter World, I think it really got the structure of playing these games. They made, re-equipping your items very easily. They made finding people a lot easier. Again, like the multiplayer side, I think it may have been like a little buggy at the start, but once it got to PC, it was very smooth to play that game multiplayer. Again,
Yeah.
a world of difference from being like a PSP or playing it on the Wii. And yeah, I think ultimately, like to kind of like sum up, like what they did was they made everything that worked as great as it could be, and they tried to remove everything that didn't work, or again, anything that slowed the player down from being able to just go in, load up a mission. Here's a giant lizard. Start attacking it.
Yeah, no, it definitely became sort of this compartmentalized experience, and I think it's really easy, like when you're building these experiences, to sort of want more preparation, want more of like kind of like an end experience. Like it's nice if you do something and it was hard, and then you get gratifying like messaging that you did something good.
Mm-hmm.
Not as nice after you've done it 30 times. It's definitely starts to become problematic after 100 times. And so like at the beginning you might feel like, oh, it's a little anemic, it was over, and then it's time to kill the next monster. And at the beginning they do mitigate that because there's a lot more running around and talking to characters in between those things.
Yeah.
But eventually it ends, it's done, you move on to the next thing quick, right? It moves the thing through. Because at some point you start to hate those moments. If it's 8 seconds of looking at like a thing, reveling in how awesome you were with like numbers and stuff, first time you see it, you're like, this is the greatest thing ever. I feel like I deserve this. And then 100 times later, you're like, if I have to watch one more of these, I'm gonna kill somebody.
Yeah. Although I will say the one thing that will never get old in Monster Hunter World are the cooking cutscenes. The greatest like food
Right.
porn I think ever put into a game.
And it's a nice little kind of like Gears of War active reload mechanic. It's just interesting enough to kind of, still make you think about it a little bit, but not frustrating really in any way. The cost of failing is not very high either, I suppose.
And again, like, I just have to imagine like the budget that went to just one of those cutscenes. Like, how many indie games could that have funded to get like 4K bread on a
Yeah,
plate?
so funny. Well, that's the nice thing though, having like big budget titles is if you have like a cutscene department that's going to basically be working the whole project. Well, now a week for a few cutscenes of this or that suddenly can be done, and it doesn't affect the overall budget much because it's not like you're going to let them go 2 weeks early.
For the indie devs watching this, again, I think the main takeaway is you should have overly elaborate food cutscenes in your
Yeah,
game, no
exactly.
matter what the game is. Just have it. Give me like
Well,
high def pizza.
a conversation for an indie dev approach to something like this though is like to make a retro pixel version of a game like this that happens to be 2D.
Mm-hmm.
And or like that hybrid of 2D where 3D where you use 3D and to kind of make some of the spaces a little easier, and you throw textures on that, but then you have a lot of 2D sprite like graphics for other things so that you don't have to create like complicated character models and stuff. um, I think that, I mean, I might enjoy that quite a bit, and if you could afford to make more monster variation and stuff, and there was a little bit more kind of like strict power RPG related stuff where it's like, oh yeah, well now my number's 12, so now I can fight that. I can fight the teal version of the thing. Then as long as the loot's cool, like I could imagine putting a bunch of time into that, and maybe you can make that game for 5% of the budget of Monster Hunter World.
So I guess we've talked a lot about the positives of Monster Hunter World and just of the franchise itself. Anything that you would consider to be like an overly negative, or at least maybe just more of an issue that was still present in Monster Hunter World, if you can remember.
I do feel like there is a lot of sort of sustained frustration at running around those worlds and acquainting yourself with the pathways to get to places and falling and having to like make your way back up to other places, and there's a lot of these sort of confused failures of sort of pathing and sort of the finicky nature of rolling and moving and navigating things and not getting the results you want. It's something that happens quite a bit, and it's just okay because the other stuff that goes well is good.
Mm-hmm. Actually,
Um, Go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm glad you brought that up, because that was another thing that Monster Hunter World did that was different from the previous games, was that it removed the kind of forced loading between like each region on the map.
Yeah,
Now we're just, here's one giant map, you can go anywhere you want. And I think that's another, like, as you said a few minutes ago, like, removing like that, anytime that you can remove like dead time or wasted time from your game, do it, because it may only be 5 seconds of loading, but remember, it's 5 seconds loading each time someone has to go to a new region, and this is the kind of stuff that adds up. And as a quick tangent, it's one of the things that just kills a lot of mobile games I play, where you make something that the players who keep doing over and over again annoying. That,
yeah.
yes, it's only 3 seconds of my life, but if I have to do it like 100,000 times over the course of playing this game, 3 seconds adds up a lot.
Well, the rule has got to be that no matter what it is, it'll be annoying. It's
Mm-hmm.
just a matter of how long. So if you're expecting someone to do something many times, it's not if it's annoying. It is,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's just no escaping it. It's that the coolest thing ever is just not cool after it's been repeated too many times.
Yeah. And
And
I
it's not like it's something that you do, right? It's not like something you're interacting with. It's not a choice you're making. It'd be an interesting experiment to go back to older games that have these sort of requirements to load into areas just because of like performance reasons or like memory or computer capacities and stuff, and just add a little thing that you have to do. You have to guess the color of a thing, or you have to do a small math problem. These little things completely transform some of them if they're done right. And I'm really interested. It'd be neat to understand that better.
Mm-hmm. If I had to say there's any issue from like a monster design standpoint, I do wish, like, I like the interactivity that the monsters have in the environment. I think that again was another standout feature. I think it, as we said, it becomes a little too routine. And I think part of that is that give and take between we can't make this monster be 100% dynamic because we intend you to grind it for how many wings, horns, claws that you need for like an armor and a weapon. But just like with a lot of these games, like whenever we have these games that are very like mission or like grind focus, it always turns into work at some point. I had the
Yeah.
same exact feeling in Diablo 3. Loved that game from level 1 to 70, but the second you tell me, okay, now do greater rifts for the rest of your time, I'm just like, ugh, like I don't like forced grind. And it's probably one of the things that keeps a lot of me, or keeps a lot of like the more popular mobile games just out of my wheelhouse. I don't want to play a game where the general acceptance is you have to spend at least 30 to 40 minutes a day, or maybe like 2 hours a week, just doing the same three things over and over again.
Yeah, for sure. And well, I mean, and we know what it feels like when that grind is good because
Mm-hmm.
there's something that we're looking forward to.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, and it's this, like there's if there's a skill tree and most of the skill tree elements are just like stat changes, but over there, 7 down, there's like a thing that'll make all it makes you do is hit the button twice instead of once or something, right? Like a thing like double jump. And it doesn't have to be much, but those things make a huge difference. Suddenly everything's better now that I can double jump, right? If you get the right mechanical upgrade, everything gets fresh again. And that's sort of the art or the something really important in game
Yep.
design. Whether it's an art or not, we can have a conversation about that some other
Yep.
time.
And again, it's that difference between there's an intended end of the grind or a goal of the grind versus the goal is to grind. Now, the
Yeah.
goal is you're going to do this 2 hours every week.
Well, like in the case of Diablo 3, what it is that you can expect to get like 1.5% of power gain over that amount of grinding. And then you're like, oh, well, then what happens after that? Well, it's another 1.5%. And then after that, another 1.5%. And once your brain recognizes that that's going to go on forever, then it's hard. It's real hard at that point, right? You're like, oh, there's no hope of any variation after that. In
Exactly.
fact, now it's like, oh, I'm just desperate to get this one item and it drop and it have these three things that are on it.
Mm.
And I got one. Oh, I got two. Oh, I got one. Oh, I got two. Oh, I got, and you do that
You're
400 times, and then you get three, and you're like, okay, I'll stick with three. And
you're
then,
you're giving me
well,
like
like,
PTSD from
I
playing
know
Diablo
totally. And then it's
3.
like, then the moment that happens, it's just your mind goes, oh, now I just do that again. And you're like,
And
okay,
again,
maybe it's time to stop. But but if there's something out there, even if it's really far out there, that's like that's sort of like a meaningful change or a meaningful gain or improvement. Now that we know how much that can make the grind actually enjoyable, and
hmm
I feel like my experiences with Diablo and with Destiny, especially in recent times, is make there be a skill that you're going to be building that takes a lot of iteration to get perfect at, and then
hmm
just change up the skill tiny bit because now it's me, right? It's like a Dark Souls like experience. Like, can I go from 99.9% effective to 99.99? And at some point, can I get to 100? But if I get 100 at something, then something new has to show up, or else I'm done, right? It's like, oh, I'm perfect at this now, so that means I don't need to do it.
hmm
The game of engagement in game design is there are a number of sort of non-obvious rules that are in
hmm And yeah, I think again, like, I have one final question to ask you, but to like add on to that point, I think this is again why they add in new monsters. They add in something new to at least spice it up. Now, again, it's kind of it solves the problem short term, but unless your development team's going to be working on this one game for the next 20 years, you're going to eventually run out of things, but it does extend the game. As we said, like, some people play this for that challenge. They're going to play and say, I want to beat every single Elden Dragon. That is my goal. Once that's done, the game is done. And having like that more variety to it does help out.
Oh, for sure, yeah. And I mean, you know, at some point, you can strip away all the specifics and almost have like kind of like an information theory perspective on it. It's like, what percentage is it viewed differently by the user? And is that percentage enough to keep them viewing it? Is it enough for it to feel that there's enough newness that they would prefer to continue playing than prefer to stop? And whatever that threshold is, I'm sure we'll get very sophisticated. I'm sure machine learning tools will help us understand these lines even better as time goes on.
Mm-hmm.
But somewhere in there is what the true understanding of what motivates us to play and or motivates us to stop.
Mm-hmm. And speaking about motivating us as a play, here's my last question for you, and then we'll wrap things up. So I want to get your thoughts on this final point. What do you think about the structure they use for expansions? And for people who don't know what we're referring to, every single expansion for a Monster Hunter game will always focus on post-endgame challenge. Like, their expansions are not designed to be supplemental. Like, they will integrate stuff into the main game. It's basically, here's our main game, and then the expansion is like this chunk over here. Because I know the expansions have even worse churn rates than their main game. And the expansions are oftentimes where they will add a brand new game system. They'll add something like new that was not in the base game. But it never it feels like they're adding on rather than improving the whole experience. I want to get your thoughts on that. Like what do you think of that structure for their expansions?
So I don't think it's awesome, but I do think that it makes a lot of sense because it's stuff that they can do. And frankly, it's complicated. The actual main game is pretty complicated. I would be hesitant to throw a wrench into it and change it. Like, and if it is already effective at carrying players for dozens and dozens and dozens of hours, then you can leave it to continue to do that. And so this idea that you tack on that the expansion expands end game is sort of sensible in that regard. It's just that I think part of it is that it's just too costly to kind of change the base game fundamentally, right? I mean, like, it's just a nightmare. Like, let's say even like adding a new weapon is kind of risky, right? It's like, oh, the new weapon needs to, and all its animations and its power curve needs to work with all the monsters that presently exist. And they do that at times, and that is a thing that can be found, but it's not something you can. It's not easily guaranteed, and it's by no means a small amount of work. And the sort of the information theory aspect of it is kind of sort of horrifying. But we can tack stuff onto the end and just take the ball right at the end of in endgame and then move it forward. So it's so doable. I think they have to do it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And those of us that make it there, we're the users they care about anyways.
Yeah. And I think, as you said, like, the size of the game already is an important point. Like, I do wonder, like, what is the budget for the expansion versus the budget for the main game? Because obviously they know that the expansions aren't going to be played by anywhere near the same amount of people who bought the base game. And like you said, like, it is very much like the opposite of, say, something like what Paradox does. Many of Paradox's expansions just supplement that main game, but it is very daunting to look at Paradox Interactive game and say, here's the base game, here's 47 different expansions that you could buy that all add in systems that you probably have no idea what they're about.
But the hardcore players, it is a similar structure, though. Yeah. It doesn't play out the same way because their games are already very amenable to creating sort of like structural changes that change the whole thing, right? They put in new DNA and then you replay the game. And then they put in new DNA and you play the game with both the new DNA. and or oh, I haven't bought anything for 6 months. I come back, I buy 9 pieces of DNA, and then play the game with all 12 things in it. Right? It's their game structures can accommodate that because the way people play it is totally different. Right? It's not that I'm going to continue with that family that I've been running for in Crusader Kings, and the expansion is going to happen, and that's going to affect that playthrough. We're going to start over again. Cities Skylines the same way. And I bet it's the same sort of. Well, I think Monster Hunter probably pays a larger percentage for their expansions than the Paradox games do, because the Paradox games are, I think, sort of purpose built for that to work that way in some ways as well. Like they found a good groove because they also sell a lot of those expansions, or not even expansions isn't the right way. Like sort of module attachments, maybe is a better way to describe the Paradox approach.
Yep.
I would say I would guess though that although the expansions are probably pretty costly, that it's just a pretty small fraction of the overall budgets, big time.
All right, so
it's more that we can do it, so we should, and we like our players, so we'll make them happy.
All right. So, any final points from you about Monster Hunter's design, Monster Hunter World? Yes, no, anything like that before we wrap up for the episode?
Maybe just to harken back to that comment about making like an indie version of the game,
mm-hmm.
that something I think everyone should kind of pay attention to is when a new shape for a game comes out, that it can inspire us to make games of all types that use that new shape. Like you could make a text adventure about Monster Hunter, and that the timings and the things that you have to do at every step would still kind of work, even if you were selecting from like lists of things every step of the way, and it was just ChatGPT saying what you were doing and flipping and putting a spear in the monster's face or something. That it wouldn't. You could evoke that pattern, and that means that there are these different approaches to making the same kind of game. I think that are out there for all of these games that come out. That when we find, especially games that occupy people for hundreds of hours.
Mm-hmm. And I guess for my final points, again, getting a very solid, replayable chunk of gameplay is a lot harder than it sounds, especially when you're trying to balance multiple different weapons. And the hooks of Monster Hunter, as you said, could work in other genres and other designs. But again, you need to balance that with how are you going to do something different, because I think Monster Hunter, as we said, occupies that same space as Vampire Survivors, that you can't just make the same thing and expect someone to play your take versus theirs. It has to be something legitimately different. And it's why we oftentimes, when we have these very, like, super laser focused designs, that people don't copy them, or they keep as far away from them because they know they'll never going to be able to just say make Shadow the Colossus but shadowier or more colossier. It has to be something different, and even as an indie developer, you have to understand that. Like, as we said, with something like Stardew Valley may have had DNA from Harvest Moon and Rune Factory, but it was still its own original design beyond that.
Yeah.
So, I think that is going to do it for me. My voice is about out. I have dinner waiting. Unfortunately, I don't have a 4K cutscene for how dinner gets made around here. So, for the people watching, I want to know, how many of you watching this are Hunting Horn mains? Let us know in the comments down below. And Tomo, as always, has been a pleasure hanging out with you. If you have any new places to mention, link back to, go right ahead.
I mean, it's we're still working on Epic Tavern on Steam in early access, hoping to get that sucker out of early access as soon as is reasonable, but we don't put a ton of development bandwidth towards it because of the other projects that we have. And I think that's it for now. And it was a pleasure, as always, to get on and talk about games with you.
Mm-hmm. And we'll need to see if we can bug the roundtable for doing another topic, especially talk more about ARPG and RPG design. But for the people watching, if you have a particular game you'd like us to try and cover for one of these episodes, let us know. Do the YouTubing stuff. Check out all my books on design. By the time this goes up, we should either be in the middle of or wrapping up the Game Wisdom Game Jam, and that's going to be a lot of fun to check out. But Everyone, come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where you examine the art and science of games. And until our next episode, take care.
Bye, guys.